Okay, so it's Justin and Ilaria, and we're DWA 103, Section 2.
Yeah.
We are going to be focusing on the 2008 global financial crisis. So we decided to focus on the Southeast Asian countries when looking at the 2008 financial crisis. And these countries are Brunei, Cambodia, Indonesia, Laos, Malaysia, Myanmar, Myanmar, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. So a very quick summary on what the Great Recession was. The Great Recession was a period of marketed general decline observed in national economies globally during the late 2000s and early 2010s. The scale and timing of the recession varied from country to country, and the International Monetary Fund has concluded that it was the most severe economic and financial meltdown since the Great Depression and is often regarded as the second worst downturn of all times. We will be looking at it from a realist and Marxist view. I will be explaining the realist view, and Justin will be talking about Marxism. So realism in the DWA world essentially means everyone is out for themselves. It states that individuals are self-interested and states are just made up of individuals. So essentially a realist claims that there's only so much resources to go around and everyone's got to survive. So you should look out for yourselves because no one else will look out for you. So essentially beat them to the backstabbing. Go ahead, Justin. Explain Marxism.
Yeah. And the core idea of Marxism is that humans are productive beings and that all economic value comes from human labor, because it's a socioeconomic theory, not necessarily an ideology, and it's very much not purely economic. It also maintains, or Karl Marx maintained, that class struggle is at the center of all social evolution, that the history of all existing human society is the history of class struggle. So it's based on the ideals of equality and class solidarity, which sort of places it in direct contention with some of what led up to the 2008 crisis.
So we decided to study the Southeast Asian countries with the 2008 crash just due to the interesting way this shaped and changed their interaction in an international economy. They were all able to bounce back fairly quickly, and some of these countries, due to this crash, were able to actually become major world players in an economic view. Next, we're going to talk about how would a realist and a Marxist explain what happened during the 2008 Great Recession. So essentially, a realist would just say it came down to people started spending beyond what they had, both in individual markets and in national markets. People just spent more than they had, so therefore it was a big game in inflation, and when it all came crashing down on them, people thought they had more than they had, and it caused worth of everything to essentially fall and go down. Justin, go ahead.
Yeah, so the main Marxist explanation for what happened leading up to and during the Great Recession is, of course, focused on the capitalist class, the banks and the financiers. It sort of lays out the process through which banks and financiers lent to property developers who hired labor, who hired workers to build houses, which were then purchased by the laborers with a mortgage loan, often from the very same banks and financiers. So oh my God.
Just keep going, it's fine.
Okay, wait. So the way a Marxist explains the lead up to and what happened during the 2008 financial crisis is, of course, centered around the capitalist ruling class. The banks and the financiers, who in the process laid out by like a Marxist perspective explaining it, they lent to property developers who hired laborers to build houses, which were then purchased by the laborers with a mortgage loan, often from the very same banks and financiers. So first of all, such like a system like that is inherently speculative and prone to producing housing bubbles. That situation and that bubble became dangerously exacerbated when banks, because of their greed, made loans which they knew people wouldn't be able to repay, especially in an era of wage repression, which is inherent to capitalism. That's the Marxist perspective. So at the same time as all this predatory and reckless lending was happening, wage repression by the same capitalist class produced a deficit of effective demand because of the reduced buying power of the working class, which became covered by increasing indebtedness to the aforementioned financiers, which ultimately leads to a financial crisis, which then becomes resolved by state interventions like bailouts, and the stimulus, which then translates into a fiscal or debt crisis of the state, which, according to the conventional capitalist economic wisdom, is best resolved by further reductions in the social wage, like pension cuts, a lower minimum wage, or weakened labor protections.
Perfect. All right. Next, we're going to talk about how a realist and a Marxist perspective influence how we think and what lessons came from the 2008 financial crash. So both perspectives agree that the financial crash was, if not inevitable, at a very least not an anomaly. Realists and Marxists are united in the understanding that the financial institutions are responsible for the crash, where themselves. Where these two views kind of start to butt heads and differ is what actions should be made to avoid this from happening again, if it's possible to avoid, or if it's just kind of a natural thing that is to happen to our economy. So realists will claim that inequality in a global capitalist system revealed by the 2008 financial crisis is natural, and there's no way to avoid it. And this is just due to the selfish nature of individuals and states, which would inevitably lead to people spending beyond their means and taking more than what's theirs and not leaving like an equal amount for everyone. That's pretty much it. So go ahead for the Marxists.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the Marxists and the realists have the same idea that...
That's right.
So how does a Marxist perspective influence how we think about the 2008 crash and what caused it? So it's really interesting that both realists and Marxists agree that it came about because of self-interest. But the Marxist perspective sort of takes that analysis to another step and says it's not just self-interest, it's greed, because it's not that self-interest isn't representative of the world's natural state, like a realist would contend that it is. So a Marxist, sort of looking back at the 2008 crash and thinking about it, says that the 2008 crash just exposed the inherent unsustainability of a capitalist system in which greed is the primary motivation.
Okay, so now, as we promised, we're going to look a little bit more into Southeast Asia and how the 2008 crisis has affected them and their countries, and how and why they're able to bounce back so quickly. Justin is going to explain on the effect it made on these countries, and I'm going to explain a little bit later about how they're able to bounce back so quickly. Go for it, Justin.
Yeah, so one of the things that people were really surprised about the situation in Southeast Asia after 2008, like through 2008 was how incredibly quickly Asia as a whole, and especially Southeast Asia, got hit, and also how much they were able to bounce back and recover and sort of mitigate like the worst excesses that some other countries saw. So the peak of the market in Asia was July 2008. The trough, when it was at its lowest, was February 2009. So from that period, intra-Asian exports, so exports from Asian countries to other Asian countries within the region, fell by 48% from peak to trough. Compare that to I hate to say only, but only a 29% fall in exports to the United States and the EU 15 from peak to trough. It's almost a 20% difference. And part of that is because electronics, including machinery and transport parts and components, accounted for about 70% of that intra-Asian trade. And those components are intermediate goods. They they aren't the final products ready to head to market in mainly more developed Western countries. Those parts cross national borders multiple times, and so they go through more levels of the global production economy than finished products that sometimes more developed countries export. And so because of that, a fall in end demand, in particular in the United States and the G3, Germany, France, and the UK, had a magnified impact on Southeast Asia's trade within the Southeast Asian region. So this helps to explain why there was a steeper decline in intra-Asian exports relative to the decline in exports to Western countries during the crisis, and why they were hit so quickly. So many of the countries relied so much on this export economy that an even slight fall in demand in the United States and Europe led to an immediate economic impact on their production economy. And Southeast Asian countries were also hurt worse than China or India, and other Asian countries, which is why it's important to look at like Southeast Asia within Asia, because the Southeast Asian region has far less domestic demand to pick up the slack.
That's very interesting. Okay, now we're going to talk about what this financial crisis has done to Asia and how they've changed their policies to help improve their financial situations. So after 1997, after the 1997 Asian financial crisis, governments, Indonesia especially, were pressured to implement, and they ended up implementing more strict regulation of financial institutions and stronger systems of corporate governments. This had two main effects. One, Southeast Asia financial institutions didn't have as much exposure to begin with because they didn't hold anywhere near the amount of toxic debt as the Western institutions did. Secondly, stronger regulations made Southeast Asian governments less susceptible to the exploitation of government aid that banks in the United States and Ireland engaged in.
Yeah, and that second effect lends itself very well to a Marxist perspective, because Marxists love to criticize banks and financial institutions. So in other words, a Marxist would say that these Southeast Asian countries, because of their strong regulation, were more resistant to the coercion of public funds by the capitalist ruling class than nations where increased exposure made them way more susceptible to being coerced by banks.
All right. And I think that's all we got, right, on the 2008 crisis?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah.
Bye.